So view and template, we've covered quite a bit of this already. The view is just AngularJS compiled DOM. The view is the product of compile, merging that HTML with scope. So you saw that. I mean, it was crystal clear when I just said, hey, compile. Here's your HTML. Get this content here. And I passed in the scope object. And it just put them together. And that's how that worked. The most important thing about this is your DOM is no longer the single source of truth. So when you previously, in another world, another life, is when I would try to submit a form. So I'd have this massive form. I'd be like, OK, I'm ready to submit this. Well, if it was in jQuery, I'd have to go loop through. And I would be like, get this element dot value. And so then I would construct this this object on submit to basically send to the server. Well, that's, once again, you're putting your state into your DOM. And how do you even test that? There's a lot of bad things about doing that. And that's kind of another conversation for another time. But by pulling that state out and putting it into your scope or into a service, it makes everything so much easier to test. HTML is great for layout. It's great for visual things. But it's not good for imperative behavior, logic. And so that is where was the real limitation for jQuery and some of these other kind of pre-modern kind of JavaScript frameworks, is that it mixed the two. And I think even to having, on one hand, keeping your imperative logic out of your view is really important. But at the same time, I think it's important to keep your declarative markup out of your imperative kind of domain. And so I showed you kind of a contrived example with those string templates. But at the same time, there's JavaScript frameworks that try to just completely destroy HTML. They're like, HTML is stupid. We're going to do it all JavaScript. And it becomes, at that point, all your HTML is basically string files in JavaScript. First of all, how do designers work with that? They don't. You've really just kind of chopped your designers off at the knees. But secondly, how do you understand the hierarchical relationship? HTML was designed to establish layout. It's very good for that. And so having Angular say, we're not going to destroy HTML. Yes, it's limited. But instead of just getting rid of it and just killing it, let's extend it and make it smarter. And so that's where you let HTML, your declarative markup, do the things that it's good at, which is layout. And you separate the logic and the things that you need to test into basically controllers and services. And I think that's why you see that big whoop, blue uptick on the trends, is because the way that they've handled that, I think, is really good. Is because they're playing to the strengths of declarative markup with imperative behavior. Does that make sense? Cool. So yeah, this is kind of how this works. I'm kind of reiterating concepts here, but
one
yes,
question
sir.
About the scope. Do you ever return a function and set the scope equal to a function?
When I'm testing. But generally, I never manually set the scope. Well, that's not true. I'll see if I can give you this answer in 30 seconds. On occasion, and I believe this is how Bootstrap UI does this, you will need to construct a modal that lives on top of everything. And you need to dynamically add that to the DOM. And so at which point you will actually, a lot of times, create a child of the root scope. So at that point, you will manually create a scope. And then you will then attach basically your HTML, your modal dialog, to the DOM and compile them together. But rarely do you ever need to do that, because either your scope is implicitly created via an ng repeat, or it's injected for you. And then you just use that. And so only on edge cases do I ever need to actually manually create a scope. It injects it for you. And that's what you want, because it has hooks into the digest cycle. and all those events baked in. But you could manually do that. But I would certainly, if I was manually creating scope, it would be a child of root scope, or the scope that I was already in. But there's not really there are reasons, but like I said, they're edge cases. Does that make sense? Okay.